I now give the floor to Tang Nguyen-Quoc. Sorry for my pronunciation, but Tang comes from the OECD, so we value a lot what the OECD have to tell us as a think tank, and he comes from the Development Center. So his presentation, which should be similar to Iman's, around 8 to 10 minutes, is connecting farmers to markets in Africa. So we look forward to your presentation. It's actually Africa's development trajectory in the evolving global context, but I'm sure that you will speak about markets as well from the OECD.
Thank you very much, Leonard, for the introduction, and also thanks to Isolina for the invitation. So my name is Tang, and I'm at the Africa unit of the OECD Development Center. Just to tell you a little bit about what we do. So for the past 5 years, our Africa team has been working very closely with the African Union Commission on a number of projects, starting from collecting revenue data from revenue authorities in 22 different African countries to harmonize it into an internationally comparable data set. And also, we are working with them to produce what is the first annual economic report done by the African Union Commission. It is called Africa's Development Dynamics. The first edition in 2018 was on growth, employment, and inequalities in Africa, and then we also do a lot of partnership dialogue together with the yes, so that is me. Sorry, everybody online for that. And we also organized together the Africa Forum that was in Paris in October last month. And I'm very glad to see there's a few of you that already attended and enjoyed the session. Mansivisi from Devco was there, as well as the Ghanaian president. So for the time is short today, I'm going to talk about two things specifically. The first thing is to talk about the national development strategy in Africa and compare it with Asia and Latin America. Why? Because rural development doesn't happen by itself, but within a broader national development context. And also Africa is within the global economic system. We need to compare with other aspects to see how good we are doing. And second, I'm going to talk about 5 mega trends that are shaping the development dynamics to look what is evolving further forward. So as we look into what has been the growth stories in Africa since 2000, we see that it is actually a pretty good stories with growth in the continent reaching about 4.6% a year since 2000 until 2016. This is still a bit lower than developing countries in Asia, but quite a bit better than Latin America. So that's some good news. Africa in the process has also diversified trade partnership with other regions in the world, where the trade with non-traditional partners have now tripled from about $275 billion dollars a year in 2000 to almost 800 million in 2016. So we have diversified our trade partnership. But behind this story, there's a number of challenges ahead. First, as you see, the growth curve is very volatile and is smoothed out for 55 African countries. So first, we see that Africa is not a country. There's a lot of heterogeneity. So the situation varies from double-digit growth in Ethiopia to very little growth in many other countries. And second, because of the many countries, especially the large economies in the region, are still highly dependent on exports of commodity. That means that the growth trajectory is still very volatile, going up and down. As you see, around 2015 to 2016, there is a dip because of commodity price losing almost half of its value. And then we And then the second part is, does it mean for development? Take poverty, for example. We see that from 2000 on, many African countries have made great progress in poverty reduction. This is great news. But most of these countries that have managed to reduce poverty by a significant amount are those that went to the HIPIC program, the highly indebted poor countries. These countries have reduced poverty level to the similar level as we see in very fast-growing Asian countries like China, Vietnam, or Indonesia. But as we move further forward, there's a number of problems. First, the challenge is still very high. 36% of the population is still living in absolute poverty. The number of people who are living in absolute poverty has actually increased since 1990, from 280 million to now 395 million people living in poverty. It's the total number. Also, as I mentioned, most countries that have reduced poverty the most are those benefited from the HIPIC program, so the debt relief that allow countries to have the fiscal space available to them to spend on education, health, and other poverty reduction initiatives. And now as the HIPIC program is coming to the completion, and many African countries are facing a very difficult, facing a tightening of their fiscal space with the debt, with more than half of the countries already in what the IMF classifies as debt distress, then finding the political commitment, the funding necessary to continue this progressive poverty reduction will be even more difficult in the years ahead. And as we look further in the long term, what is the driver of growth and development in the long term? One of them is productivity. And here, as you can see, there's a graph that decomposes labor productivity by whether or not it's by within sector or by structural transformation. It is a complicated graph, but in a nutshell, we see that structural transformation are happening. So in the way that Dr. Araba mentioned earlier, we're seeing diversification. But what kind of diversification? We do see that employment are moving out of agriculture, but unlike Asian countries where they move to manufacturing, agricultural labor are now moving to what we call the non-tradable services. So the retails and hotels, restaurant sectors, these are very good jobs, especially when you compare the average productivity level, then they have higher productivity than agricultural workers. But in the long term, there is not a sustainable strategy. Why? Because these sectors have their absorbing limit. So that as more workers move into this sector, the aggregate productivity level goes down. So this is why when you look into that circle, you see a negative 0.9 percentage point a year offsetting a productivity decline, labor productivity decline. So in this way, as you see, another region on the right-hand side of the graph is Latin America, is facing a similar situation. What do we see? Both Africa and Latin American, many countries are facing what economists call the premature industrialization and finding the job necessary to absorb the 30 million new workers into the labor market a year in Africa between now and 2030 will be quite challenging without the other viable career option. So that was three basic messages. Growth was good, challenges ahead, especially when it comes to poverty reduction and productivity increase. And now I will talk about the second part, the different mega trends that will affect Africa's development strategy. And I have 2 minutes, right? So there's 5 different mega trends are affecting. The shifting wealth, the rise of new economic powers in the global economic orders with the rise of not just China, but also Brazil and India. I just mentioned earlier where Africa's trade with the new partners have tripled. So they bring not just new trade opportunities, but also technologies. Other there are other changes at the global level. So climate change, new production revolution that we talked a lot about earlier, about Industry 4.0 and how to apply these technologies. There's also changes that is organic to Africa. So there's a double whammy of demographic dividends and urban transition. And today, and right now, I'm going to pick on a single point on the urban transition. On the right-hand side, you will see that urban population in Africa is increasing very rapidly, as well as rural population. And by 2035, the majority of Africans will be living in urban area. Now, if we think about urbanization, there's a temptation to think of large cities like Lagos, like Cairo. But actually, if you were to look at the increase in urban population between 2000 and now, 2018, 2/3 of that increase in urban population come from cities and towns of 500,000 or less. These are the intermediate cities I'm talking about, like Kisumu in Kenya or Arusha in Tanzania. And these cities and towns serve multiple functions, super important for rural development. Research in Ethiopia shows that agricultural productivity increase as the farmers are closer to cities. It also provides the basic services and infrastructure necessary. They allow opportunities for rural non-farm jobs creation. And they're also good for poverty reduction in general because it's just closer to home. So there's a great study in Tanzania. I see you have it outside from Look Christian Center to show that migrants from rural area in Tanzania, when we move to the nearby intermediate cities, their likelihood of exiting poverty is a lot higher than moving to the big cities. With all these wonderful things about intermediate cities, why don't we hear about it more often, right? Because it is sort of stuck in between the top-down with central government. When they think about urbanization, they go for the big capital cities, and the rural development approach that basically left intermediate cities somewhere in a vacuum. And this is where I want to highlight, just to bring it back to your point about the need for a territorial approach. This is where things happen. This is where economic activities happen. This is where people find jobs. And this is where a lot of investment needs to be done. Now, as we are working on rural development in Ethiopia, and we realize that government are only starting to pay attention to this problem. And the one thing we know for sure is we don't know much about what is going on in intermediate cities in Africa due to lack of data and political interest. So we are also starting a new project on understanding what is it like to be developing intermediate cities in Africa, and especially on what are the different financing schemes available to mayors and municipalities for these cities. And just to recap on my points, because I'm definitely running over time, 3 points. First, we have growth has been pretty good so far, but there are a number of challenges ahead, both in short term and in the longer term. And in the longer terms, there are a lot of new opportunities that we can take advantage of, and we have to be aware of to prepare ourselves. And third is, as we try to organize move further forward with the agenda on digitalization and meeting with entrepreneurship, place matters as well. We should also keep in mind where these things are happening, and in many cases, it's also intermediate cities. And we have more information in the report. We have some few copies outside, but thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tang. I strongly recommend the participants to read the report on Africa development dynamics. I think what Tang mentions, what's happening in the cities is very interesting. There was, I think, a recent article in The Economist showing what type of urbanization and what are the limits of the urbanization in terms of creaking infrastructure, bad quality of these mega cities. And I think the dynamics around secondary or intermediary cities and how they are linked to rural areas is going to be key in this transformation, especially with the demographic growth and with the expectations of what youths want in terms of quality of life in Africa.